So I'm going to move on to Karen. And Karen, you're going to talk about the role of the commercial sector. So thank you very much.
Okay. I'm going to be talking, following on from Atto's presentation, a little bit about more about the pull system. First of all, I'm going to talk about who are the private sector. It's made up of many different players, manufacturers, both large scale and small scale, finished product, packagers, transportation, and then we get into the distribution at lower levels at retail, at hawkers, pharmacies, market stores where predominantly nets are sold, and other retail outlets. As well, when we're considering the private sector, we can look at major corporates as well, commercial corporate social responsibility programs and employee programs. So I include them in looking at who the private sector players are. We've touched on already that the experimentation into private sector methods has been going on for some time, but then has been sort of halted by this incredible mass campaign push. And so much of the learning has happened, and then it stopped, and we're hopefully moving back into that territory where we can build on what we previously knew. But originally, prior to the long-lasting nets in the before 1990s, nets were a low-cost, low-tech textile market product made by sometimes little cottage industry people working with their single sewing machines. And there were many diverse suppliers with functioning retail networks. Now we've moved into a much different picture, and currently today we have 10 long-lasting insecticide-treated net manufacturers, relying on essentially 2 to 3 donors, the World Bank, Global Fund and PMI, and for 90% of sales going through these 10 manufacturers. So the local industry and retail channels are in somewhat of a decline, and there has been a call for these large-scale manufacturers to diversify their customer base from those 2 to 3 donors, the institutional purchasers, to retail channels, to move beyond the public sector to buyers in the retail channels to get the product out to the end user, the consumer. Utilising the private sector can increase access, and what Fraser describes as the multiplier effect can therefore ensue. With multiple channels and multiple points of issue, which you can obtain with the retail sector, we can get much better maintenance of continuous distribution systems. So when the nets that have been issued for free are running out or being ruined, we can move to replacement nets from the private sector. I'm just going to give you a sort of, I won't dwell on this, but just to give you a picture of the retail supply chain and the various different points at which we can intervene. And I'll briefly highlight some of the engagement strategies that we have used and can continue to experiment with. But obviously there's manufacturer level, both international and domestic manufacture. There's the distribution logistics level with the wholesaler, distributors, warehousing, transport. Subsidies can go in here and have been tried to subsidise in that distribution logistics section. And then finally, at the point of issue, where the retailer or equally at ANC clinics, that there's also interventions that have experimented with intervening at that level, all to end up with benefiting the consumer at the end. I wanted to highlight a paper. I don't know if Jane Webster's here, is she? She was going to be here, but she's not come. She, in 2005, put together a very interesting look at how coverage levels of nets where coverage levels are low in this column with Nigeria heading it up. They're very different markets and contexts within which we operate. So there's no one-size-fits-all strategy that we can adopt. And this was an interesting cut at how different countries are are managing with equitable distribution. And what I found quite fascinating was the countries which I'm less familiar with, I work mainly in Africa and some Southeast Asia, is that the countries with a high coverage at that point, was greater than 30%, were these, the Gambia, Madagascar, Mali, where they didn't have patent factories. They were small-scale stitchers with lots of diversity. And what in the Webster paper she showed was that diversity of supply is a factor in high coverage, which I thought was a useful thing to look at. I'm trying to rush now because I think I'm going to get cut off by you.
No, you're quite generous.
Oh, thank you.
Not too generous.
That's very kind. Okay, so I'm going to look at 4...
5 minutes.
Oh, that's great, thank you. 4 strategies that I'm going to talk about, which have had varying levels of experimentation. First is market-based approaches, and there are financing mechanisms that can be used, such as the removal of taxes and tariffs to make net products and make nets much more affordable at importation stage. And there's also things like product subsidies which are being applied, such as AMFM, and they're not being used to nets, that's for malaria treatment. But there's experimentation where we could look at maybe manufacturer-based subsidies being applied, as the AMFM programme showed in treatment. The marketing mechanisms are the ones that have had the most experimentation, and there are 3. Social marketing, which was tried to varying degrees of success. The early programs in Tanzania and Malawi were very useful in looking at different ways to approach social marketing. So it wasn't just simply one branded product being subsidised all the way through that distribution channel. They looked at pulling in Tanzania, pulling in manufacturers. So there wasn't. I don't know if I'm teaching people to suck eggs. So I'm going to.
I don't know.
No, I know. I thought you might not know. So I'm trying. Shall I go to you or to the room?
Well, the thing is also the whole point is it's going to go on the website, a write up. So actually, while we're talking to the room, we're talking to people beyond the room as well. So it's good to have
much more explanation there.
Well, not a lot more, but because I'm not going to give you any extra time.
Social marketing models have declined in significance because there was a belief that there is an existing private sector and the social marketing was crowding out this existing private sector. And so they moved away from the traditional social marketing approach of having their own subsidised branded product. Price subsidy programmes were therefore looked at where there was working with an existing private sector and trying to encourage or give them a market stimulus. Now, what is this was tried in Mozambique with Malaria Consortium and also Nigeria. I'm glad we've got Maxwell here from Nigeria who can hopefully enlighten us more about the latest developments in Nigeria, because the price subsidies were put in at various levels of the chain. Seed funding was given to importers to purchase product. Equally, they were given different margins were recommended at various points in the chain. It's a very complicated and messy process. I think that's the easiest way of putting it. Those models, the experimentation in those models kind of halted dramatically when we had mass campaign distribution. So a lot of Netmark was another interesting experiment. Netmark worked with a number of countries in Africa, looking at bringing net manufacturers to Africa, stimulating them to helping them remove taxes and tariffs, stimulating the market, helping them with demand creation, co-funding. All that, again, stopped suddenly, 2009, and moved to this mass distribution effort. So I think there's a lot of learning out there and a lot of resources to draw on when we're looking to the future again now about how bringing in the private sector again. A lot of the private sector players were very disgruntled to be stimulated and then told, sorry, we're going to be starting free net distribution now, but we can pull them on board again, I hope. The other system that has been, in Nigeria, the interesting thing in Nigeria is this approach M4P, making markets work for the poor. It's early days currently for their implementation, but that is looking at really dissecting the supply chain, looking at value chains and how the markets can function efficiently. And that sort of analytical approach is being tried in Nigeria, so we're very interested to know what happens with that.
We've got 2 minutes left.
I'll keep going very quickly. Hang on. The organisational collaboration is these large-scale multinationals who are usually working with their employee base, such as Marathon Oil in Guinea and various other Zambia copper mines. Administrative approaches, regulation is one, such as the HOOPI's approval processes, which again can be, hopefully can be changed, and to look at how we can make HOOPI specifications more useful to the private sector manufacturers in terms of product development. And Netmark, another sort of regulation, although soft regulation, is the idea of quality seals of approval that Netmark was using. Training is another administrative approach, such as training in logistics and distribution management. A lot of these people in the chain are small and medium-sized enterprises and are not terribly efficient, so there's opportunities to put in training programs there, not just simply price subsidies. Public empowerment approaches, this is talking a little bit more on what Atto touched on in terms of what is crucial is demand creation, and that cannot be ignored. And sometimes you can pull in the private sector to co-fund demand generation programs or awareness programs about net, such as the MTM-funded SMS campaign in Uganda. And then community participation, where women's entrepreneurial groups were selling nets in Ghana. These are all different ways of engaging with the private sector at various different levels. What I wanted to major on was this section, really, the product innovation approaches. There are product development partnerships, Unitaid, IVCC, which are looking at brokering and research and development for new insecticides, etc. And then technology transfer and scaling up local production. This is something that I was recently out in Cambodia and the Mekong region, and this is something that is particularly relevant to that market, which is very different to Africa. I feel very privileged to have seen that side of the net world. Their coverage levels are 90% through the roof, and most of that is served through the private sector. And so the only problem is that the private sector in that part of the world are selling untreated products. They're not long-lasting insecticide-treated nets. So the issue is, how do we get those nets, which are very profitable to small rag trade players, how do we get them treated? So the program in Cambodia was looking at bundling of untreated nets at a wholesale level. But other ways to look at it are, for example, new multifilament yarns which have been developed, which can be simply replace existing polyester yarn, spindles in conventional weaving factories. And so these small-scale players who are very efficient and without any international aid, without any assistance, able to get their product out into the market, could be assisted to use long-lasting fibres. Sorry.
I'm going to tell you, don't you?
I know, I'm going to keep going very, very quickly. So the opportunity, and there's opportunities for LLI and industry also in terms of obviously durability. We talked about usability in terms of, currently it's one size fits all, and certainly consumers want to have choice in their products, and so that's another thing that needs to be looked at, and obviously pyrethroid resistance coming up. I have to really rush through this. So we've got increased coverage through the mass campaigns. The benefits are realised. Is this going to have a perceived value increase for the nets? The questions are the price elasticity of long-lasting nets. Will we be able to assure equity of coverage if we're charging prices? This is the issue that you brought up, Joe. Yeah. And so the effect of this mass campaigns on the consumer market, have we destroyed it? Can it be resurrected? And what's the long-term sustainability? The voucher programs that were the big voucher program in Tanzania, very, very expensive to implement, but it's a very useful example of looking at targeted subsidy alongside private sector growth, where they have encouraged pregnant women, children under 5, to get their net with a voucher from the private sector. So I wanted to highlight that one. Now, the evidence base, I recently was involved in writing a paper with...
So, Jenna, I'm going to...
Oh, he's going to cut me off.
I'm going to cut you off in 30 seconds. So sum up, because Joe is, I can say, chomping at the bit, and I don't want to
well, the evidence base is shaky. That's what I was going to say. There are many studies. There's no comparable data sets, so it's very hard to attribute success to any one particular distribution method. I'm really rushing now. So in conclusion, we have an obligation to, an opportunity to utilise this this very fully functional distribution method, but an obligation to make sure that it fits within existing distribution systems. It's not a panacea. It won't operate on its own. It won't generate the mass campaign numbers.
Great.
I'll stop.
Thank you very much. That's really great. Thank you very much. Before we move on to, I just want to bring in, because one of the things I like about a group like this is we've got people across the value chain, and we've got 3 of the manufacturers who are present. So I just want to get their view on what it is. So I know we've got
Going forward, sorry, you need to go back.
Mikhail from Vestergaard, we've got Egon from BASF, and Ellie from Sumitomo. So it'd be good to hear from each of you about, because there are various things out there there's about price, there's about distribution, there's about supporting small-scale manufacturers, and different ways of, there's regulation, there's quality.
There's a mic, just put it there.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Do you want to just introduce yourself quickly, so one of those who are
My name is Mikhail Askar. I'm with a company by almost the same name.
Right, and is the company, is it one of the major 10?
Yes. The major.
Okay.
Major 2.
Actually, yeah.
So I think the first point that I want to make is perhaps just offer a little bit of historical insight. I've heard a couple of times today that the commercial sector pulled out of net distribution, of commercial net distribution as a result of the incredible scale-up of free nets. That is not what our data set is showing, and our involvement in the commercial sector. And I think there are 2 separate commercial sectors that we need to pay attention to. Those who are distributing the WHO-evaluated long-lasting insecticidal net, and those who are distributing what is largely untreated nets. The category of nets that are LLINs, long-lasting insecticidal nets, WHO-evaluated, they were already in a downward spiral in the commercial market when the upscale started, and that was largely because USAID pulled out its subsidy. So I think we need to pay attention to that, and so for that category, it was not because of the scale-up that they pulled out. Second, I want to mention a little bit what Hemingway talked about, which is the insecticide resistant, or the nets with improved efficacy against resistant mosquitoes. And the second generation, that is either pyrethroid with synergist or pyrethroid with growth inhibitor. The development in at least one private company started back in 2003. That's 10 years ago. It was first submitted to WHO in 2007. That's 6 years ago. And so my point here is we often look to the private sector for innovation. And we, by default, talk about innovation as product or technology innovation. And at times, innovation in terms of getting the tool out to the people who need it. We need to also think of innovation as management innovation. Because what we're looking at here is not the ability to invent something. It's management innovation to unlock innovations pile up when it comes to the next generation nets that has influence on resistance management, and it's innovation stifling because we have a lot of bad learning when it comes to submitting such nets, and are therefore scared off from developing the longer lasting net. If there is a way of cutting down so far a 6-year evaluation to a year or 4 years, then that would be an incredible place to come to. What we're definitely in need of is a clear roadmap to the market for new developments. Thank you.
Okay, and just there seems to be sort of this interest because there's these very big companies that are doing these sort of insecticide nets, and then we have lots of local suppliers who are doing nets that are untreated. Is there a danger that actually the big companies will dominate that market because actually insecticide nets and the new 3rd generation actually the small suppliers get left out or pushed out? How do you see that dynamic work?
No, I think there's lots of opportunity for cooperation, and I think in many cases that's ongoing.
Okay. I just wonder if Egon or Adam, are you both here? Yeah,
do you want to just add anything there? Just
My name is Egon Weinmüller. I'm responsible for the public health program in BSF. I would like to start with the last point, with the local manufacturers, and what Mikkel just said is really true. There is hardly any demand anymore, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, for non-treated nets or cotton nets. Some Asian countries for like the physical protection alone is not really that what is needed. There is one point and the local production has another problem of quality control. There is hardly a quality control company in sub-Saharan countries except for Tanzania, which actually can assure a quality level at a local small production, which fulfills WUPI's requirements. The other point which we didn't mention is, we talked about net distribution and the private sector distribution, which basically was gone. There is still private sector distribution going on, like we're also producing agrochemicals. So we reached the last village on a private sector distribution with agrochemicals. So it's not that the private sector, the old net distribution channels are mainly gone, but there is other distribution channels which actually can get in there, at least from the logistical side. The other point which we didn't mention at all is the net use rate. We talk about so many nets which are out there, but we don't talk about how many of them are really being used. There is all kinds of figures around. Janet or Joe will be able to tell that a lot better than I can, but my rough thumb figure is it's probably less than 60%. Talking about innovations, it's quite critical because there is a lot of money you put in for a high risk. And we are working on a Generation 3 product, and we already started that 5 years ago, and it's always going along like that. Regulations are changing, requirements are changing, so it's really a high-risk investment what you're doing. And then at the end of the day, you don't know how the donor money will actually be diverted to different types of products. The more into specific requirements like nets, Generation 3 nets, different sizes in different provinces, the more complicated the whole setup gets. Because then you don't have only 3-year nets, you may have 5-year nets. So how then do you know when you have to do replacement campaigns? You basically have to map each house with each type of net and then go back, and then you can do mass campaigns. So there is something which is nice to have, but there is another thing where you have to use 100 or you have to distribute 120 million nets per year in Africa. How do you split them up into 20 different categories? So I think that's, as this community is not really highly professionally managed like in Shell or another company like that, this is going to become a major obstacle.
Okay, very helpful. Adam, did you want to add anything?
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Adam Flynn with Sumitomo Chemical. I agree with both Mikhail and Egon on all the points they made. I will just kind of sum up, I suppose, in that, of course, the universal coverage campaigns peaking in 2010-11 were very noteworthy and are on many levels required. However, the regulatory and procurement architecture that was kind of built up in and around the same time or just prior, which facilitated those campaigns, really are now constricting innovation, as Mikhail and Egon stated, and also not really up to scratch with regards to the second generation nets which are already out there. We are in a different paradigm now, and those two systems are really still in a universal coverage campaign setup.